All right, here we go.
Okay, it does say record at the top.
It's record at the top.
Beautiful. Good, because I can't tell. Oh, yeah, there we go. I can tell. All right, super. So Stalin is born December 18th, 1878 in Georgia, which is part of the Russian Empire at the time. And the city he was born in, ironically enough, is Gori, Gori. He dies March 5th, 1953 in Moscow. He is Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 53. We'll talk about it. Lenin dies in 1924. So Stalin comes along at the right time. And Lenin, also after the revolution, he's on some real wobbly legs because economically Russia isn't doing well and those sorts of things. And people basically want him out. And this helped Stalin tremendously. Stalin was also the Soviet premier from 1941 until his death in 1953. And he truly, you think about it, Stalin helps to make the Soviets into the world power that they eventually become. And a lot of his foreign policy ideas are really what, those after Stalin, the Khrushchevs of the world and Brezhnevs and all those guys who were running around with Stalin and were some of his underlings. Stalin's ideas are carried forward by them. For the quarter century before Stalin buys the farm, so say, let's just round it off. We'll say from about 1930 until his death. It's hard to compare him to anybody else who exercised as much political power. Again, Hitler did it, but Hitler wasn't around nearly as long, right? Stalin industrialized the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That's what USSR stands for. He collectivized its agriculture very forcibly. He consolidates his power, and we'll talk about all these things, by using incredible terror tactics. So where Hitler has the SS, Stalin's got his own group that goes out and does his dirty work. Of course, he plays a big role, and maybe it's more the size of Russia that plays a big role in defeating Germany in World War II. And just real quickly, and I've talked about the mistake that Operation Barbarossa was. It initially starts out very, very well with the German army, just gobbling up ground. And where it becomes a huge issue is Hitler's generals are saying, we can drive straight to Russia and be there in plenty, drive straight to Moscow and be there in plenty of time to really bring Stalin to his knees. And Hitler overrules his generals and says, you have to take out the Russian army first. Of course, the Russian army is massive because it's got so many troops, and many of them have been forced to serve, but still, that's really what hurts Hitler in the in the long run. After the war, Russia, of course, gobbles up huge tracts of land. And even though Stalin, during the many conferences with FDR and then Truman and Churchill says, hey guys, I'm going to set up democratic societies. Yeah, right. We know what happens there after the war. So he goes complete. And part of it too is that with the Marshall Plan and with what's happening, Berlin, East Berlin, West Berlin, whatnot, the Americans have their sights set elsewhere, as do the Allies. So he is the chief architect of Russian totalitarianism, and he is an incredible organizer of these ruthless tactics. He destroys individual freedoms and fails to promote individual prosperity. It's all about socialism, right? And then communism and collectivization, and we're going to talk about that. A lot of For those of you who took the course that I did on Korea, once, so when Kim Il-sung comes into power after the war, and really carrying forward until current times, they have 5-year economic plans. Well, it's funny to call them that because they always extend them. And part of that reason is they're not very effective. Same thing happens with collectivization. And again, we'll talk about that more towards the end of today's session. What Stalin does is he creates an absolute mighty military industrial complex. And he is the one who leads Russia into the nuclear age. Now, he's gone when Khrushchev is doing the various H-bomb tests and atmospheric tests, which are an issue, leading into the Kennedy administration. But again, it's Stalin who sets all of these things up. His biography, so here's funny, talking about family histories and how family histories are exaggerated. Same thing with Stalin. His biography really has been obscured by Russian legend exaggerating his prowess as, so think of when Stalin, or pardon me, when Lenin comes into power, sorry, you have the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, right? Well, Stalin is portrayed as this young, virile, brave Bolshevik boy conspirator and a faithful follower of Lenin. Well, you'll see when we get a little deeper into it, that's not quite it. In his prime, he is seen as a universal genius. So think back to when we were talking about China, when we're talking about the history of Japan, or not history, but Japan in the 20s, 30s, 40s. They go after China, and China is so unwieldy, it's massive, but their people are scattered, and there's no real organization. Stalin, with the help of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, really helps to organize the unwieldiness of Russia and harness that power. Now, again, it does more for the elites. It does more for those in the military, those who are politically connected, as opposed to, the farmer who's in Siberia or whatever it may be. So, but Stalin harnesses all of this power. He is publicly invoked as, quote unquote, our father by the Russian Orthodox Church. And the reason for that, you would think, is if they don't call him that, they're going to see their father very quickly. He's going to make sure that that happens. So he, a big part, and we've talked about this with, think of the Nazis, think of Japan, think of Mussolini. What's one big thing that they use? Propaganda and statues and symbolism and those sorts of things. Stalin is the same way. He uses busts of himself, statues, icons, and he really becomes the object of it's almost a cult-like status. Now, again, you can almost compare it to the Kim dynasty in North Korea. If you're not on board, you're going to be underground. And, we know Stalin kills millions of people, starves them, the purges, which we'll talk about. So again, you probably hop on board with them. Stalin, as I mentioned, he is not of Russian origin. He's a Georgian. Rumors abounded that his father was actually Iranian. So interesting sorts of things. Of course, if this comes out when Stalin's alive, whoever is spreading that is going to be killed, because he's not then seen as a pure Russian or whatever it may be. His father was a poor cobbler in Gori, and then, so Georgia at the time is its own little territory, and then it becomes an imperial Russian colony. Stalin's father drinks to excess and beats him. Speaking only Georgian at home, Stalin learned Russian, which he always spoke with a very heavy Georgian accent while he attended school in Gori. He moves to a theological seminary, which again, hard to imagine, but he moves to what is then called the Tiflis, Tiflis, Theological Seminary, where, think of Stalin as a young boy. So sorry, my asthma. Who's writing about communism and socialism and all these things? Marx. So he is hooked by Marx and reads him incessantly and secretly while he's in school. Stalin is expelled in 1899 for revolutionary activity. A little bit of foreshadowing there. His mother, who he was closer to, especially since his father was drunk and beat him, always dreamed of Stalin becoming a priest. I know the feeling. My mother, who had 6 sons, wanted one of us to become a priest, and we all looked at her and said, no chance. You know, you know what you got, you know the hand you were dealt here. So it would have been almost blasphemous for one of us to become a priest. So his mother is a washerwoman. So again, very humble beginnings, but she plays a big role in his life. He is short. He is overweight. He has, the thick black hair that we see in pictures. One arm of his is actually longer than the other. I never knew that, but there you go. If that's all you learn today, Stalin's arms are 2 different sizes. Right? Exactly. Because of his dad's Iranian background, his complexion was actually darker, so very swarthy, which gave him issues at times. People would say, oh my gosh, you are, basically xenophobic, racist, those sorts of things. Insults. He, as an infant, gets smallpox. When back then, if you got smallpox, it's almost a coin flip whether or not, so he survives. So think of it. I mean, this is nuts. So Stalin is almost killed in infancy by smallpox. Hitler is exposed to poison gas in World War I, but survives. I mean, what if of the what ifs, right? If both of those guys go out, the 20th century could be a heck of a lot different. Stalin is known for great willpower. He learns to be stoic at a young age, and a lot of that is because of his father. He doesn't want to show emotion. In accordance with, so he's also from Georgia is in what's called the Caucasus region. So there was actually kind of like a Hatfield and McCoy situation in that region. There were families that he was, in a feud with over, most likely some very benign stuff. But what he does is he learns at a young age how to plot revenge. Really good trait because of these things. And a lot of it too also falls or comes from, remember, the way that he looked. He did not look like everybody else, primarily because of his father's background. So in December of 1899, although he was kicked out of school, the school asked him to become a clerk. So they said, you're not good enough to go to school here, but do you want to work here? So he says yes, only does it briefly. And it's really the only job he had that was not involved in politics. In 1900, he joins a political underground of sorts, because again, think of what's happening in Russia at this time. You still have the Tsar, right? But Marx is his ideas are gaining more and more traction, but they're still more or less against the law. So Stalin works to, what's the word? Foment might be too strong a word, but to, for labor strife and kind of be a pain in the rear end, be an agitator. That's the word I'm looking for. So he's an agitator at the time. He is noted for having, again, because we know Stalin and what happens, all of these seem to fit. He's noted for having, quote unquote, excessive zeal, all in the wrong areas, of course, but he dupes workers that he's agitating into bloody clashes with police. And what that does is the other conspirators or agitators say, hey, why are you lying to these guys? Because we need them. Like, if they aren't doing the fighting, then we're going to have to do the fighting. So after the Social Democrats, as they're known at the time, also known as Marxist revolutionaries of the Russian Empire, split into the Menshevik and Bolshevik. So they're the two competing wings. They split into, in 1903, Stalin joins, of course, the more militant group. Because who's leading this group? Lenin, the Bolsheviks. And remember, to go back to Hitler, he despises the Bolsheviks and uses them to foment his own followers. Between April of 1902 and March of 1913, a little bit more than a decade, Stalin is arrested 7 times for different revolutionary actions. He's imprisoned. He is sent into exile. And go back to what I said earlier, Stalin, as a youth, learns how to go for revenge. Revenge is a dish best served cold. Well, some of these people giving him a hard time now are going to pay in about a decade or so. The sentences that he were given were actually mild, but in Stalin's mind, it was the principle that he's being arrested and imprisoned. He makes very slow progress in the Bolshevik party hierarchy. He attends different, what were called conclaves, and it's basically a conference where they get together and say, hey, let's do this, let's push for that. In 1905 in Finland, in 1906 in Stockholm, and in 1907 in London. And the only record is that he attended, not that he really makes an impact or says anything noteworthy. However, much like, and so here's another first. This is probably the only time Joseph Stalin and Alexander Hamilton are going to be compared, but Stalin becomes a great lobbyist, a good behind the scenes guy, knows how to kind of work the levers of power. My apologies to Alexander Hamilton for that. But that's the comparison, is they're both really good at all the like behind the scenes stuff that people don't want to be involved in. So that's what Stalin does here. He helps to plan a spectacular holdup in Tiflis, which is where he went to school, was thrown out of school, and then asked to work at the school. Okay, Tiflis, by the way, is now Tbilisi. Okay, town you've most likely heard of. On June 25th, 1907, and what he does is it's basically a money grab. He's trying to get money and backing for the party. His first big political promotion comes in 1912, in February of 1912, when Lenin co-opts him to serve on the first Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party, which had finally broken completely with not only the Mensheviks, but the Bolsheviks. Their way of thinking was, you're either with us or against us. So even if you say you're not a Menshevik, if you don't say you're a Bolshevik, you're against us. So you have to be pure in thought and be a Bolshevik and a Bolshevik only. So in 1913, Lenin asks Stalin to publish an important article on Marxism and the national question. And think about it again. You still have the, you still have the Tsar running, running the show, and people at the lower end of the spectrum, right, economically and socially, are not happy. And this is where the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks are drawing a lot of their support, a lot of their power. There are huge numbers of people not doing well. So Stalin, and it's hilarious, Stalin changes his name. Actually, he's not born Stalin, right? He changes it to Stalin because in Russian, Stalin means steel. I'm not going to try to pronounce his actual name because you've seen what happens when I do that. So Stalin is slowly but surely working his way up. He edits the newly founded Bolshevik newspaper, Pravda, right? Still around, right? So he is then exiled to Siberia for 4 years, 1913 to 1917. In 1905, he marries a Georgian by the name of, I'll just say her first name, Ekaterina, all right? I think it's Svadnitsa. I'm not sure though. She dies in 1907 and leaves Stalin with a son, Jacob, who Stalin basically treats the way that he was treated by his father. So Jacob actually tries to kill himself in the 1920s. He fails, and because of that, Stalin calls him a weakling. Father of the Year, he's not. So during World War II, Jacob is taken prisoner by the Germans. The Germans come to Stalin and say, we will exchange your son for another high profile, for the son of this general or whomever it may be. Stalin says, thanks, but no thanks. What a dad.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right? So I'm sure there weren't a lot of Father's Day cards coming to Joseph at that time. So after Siberia, Stalin goes to Petrograd in March of 1917. We're about 7 months out from the October Revolution, right? And a lot of it's driven by Russia's failures in World War I. So the war is still going on. Stalin comes back to resume editing Pravda. He briefly advocates Bolshevik cooperation with the provisional government, which is, of course, goes against every fiber of the Bolsheviks' being. And in the provisional government at the time, you have middle-class liberals that had succeeded to power on once Tsar Nicholas gets the heck out of town. Well, he's killed, right? So under Lenin's influence, Stalin soon switches from these moderate liberal policies to the more militant policy, and he pushes it big time. And this is a theme moving forward, armed seizure. So good stuff here. In November 1917, when the coup occurs, Stalin plays an important role, but less prominent than his number one rival, Leon Trotsky. Okay, so what happens here? Stalin at the time is now, he's politically involved, he's militarily involved. And from 1918 to 1920, there's a civil war in, the factions of the October Revolution come together and say, hey, we're running the show. No, we're running the show. Stalin holds two different posts in the Bolshevik government. He is known as the, here's a title for you. He's the Commissar for Nationalities from 1917 to 1923, and then he's the Commissar for State Control. Sounds like some real heavy hitter sorts of things. And the Commissar for State Control also was known as the Commissar for Workers and Peasants Inspection. So he's doing both of these from 1917, between 1917 and 1923. However, it's that position of Secretary General that we mentioned that he assumes in 1922 until his death that really allows him to draw power for his dictatorship. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Any questions, any comments? Okay, if anything comes up, stop me. So Stalin, and this, so here we're going to compare him again to Hamilton because he's done all these things behind the scenes earlier. He's made connections with movers and shakers in the new government, in the new state political machine. What he does is he outmaneuvers Trotsky and another rival by the name of Gregory, here we go, Zinoviev. I killed that, but they hate the lobbying that Stalin does, and of course Stalin's doing it well, and he's reaping the rewards. Stalin, because he didn't finish school, people thought that he was kind of adult, D-O-L-T, which of course is a big error on their part. So in the spring of 21, we're going to step back a second. Lenin has a pretty grave crisis. So after the revolution, people are upset with Lenin. They're saying, wait, you promised us sunshine and lollipops and we're not getting it, right? So peasants and workers are resorting to violence. And this is the base of their support. All over the country, communist officials and soldiers are being attacked in rural areas as peasant armies carry out guerrilla tactics. And of course, then the army's reprisals are as brutal or more brutal. So there are several strikes that sweep the country, beginning in Moscow in February of 1921. At the end of February, there is a mutiny in the naval base, the Kronstadt naval base near Petrograd. Sailors' demands include free elections, which sounds crazy, right? Talking about Russia, but with every likelihood that this mutiny is going to spread, Lenin takes action. On March 16th, a massive attack is launched on the naval base. Bombings, artillery fire, an assault across the ice by 50,000 Red Army troops. Just incredible. On the 17th, 10,000 of the 50,000 Red Army troops are dead because of the fighting that's been going on. But the mutiny is over. 2,500 of the mutineers or rebels that survive are shot on sight without trial. They're seen as traitors. At this, this is really the first big step forward when you talk about, in a decade, Stalin's going to put this on steroids with his purges and those sorts of things. But this is really the first step of the Communist Party, kind of sort of going after their own. The 10th Party Congress happens to be taking place in Moscow with all of this going on. Lenin uses the crisis to consolidate his power. There's pressure within the party, and a group forms calling itself the Workers' Opposition. And what it's arguing for are union rights for workers. So Lenin puts forward a motion condemning the workers and receives a massive majority of support from the Congress. He then succeeds in passing a resolution of his own, which bans the formulation of factions within the party. Think about it. How did Lenin come about? The Bolsheviks were a faction of the the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks who broke off. So technically, Lenin's own party started as a faction, and now he's saying no more factions. Again, you're either with us or you are against us. So moving forward, decisions of the Central Committee can be criticized, but only if you criticize, kiss your family goodbye, because you're going for a train ride to Siberia if you survive. So from March of 1921, the control of the Central Committee of the Communist Party really is as secure as it's going to be. This is a big move that Lenin makes. Acknowledging that economically, that the attempt for the party to requisition the peasant farmers were supposed to give their entire harvest to the party, right? And this, when we talk about collectivization, these sorts of things are going to happen again. But the party says, of course, if you're a peasant farmer, are you going to give your entire harvest to the party? Absolutely not. You have to feed your own family, right? And sell and all these sorts of things. So Lenin realizes that this has been a real disaster. And what he does is he persuades the 10th Party Congress to take a vote in what becomes known as the New Economic Policy, or NEP. Peasants are to be allowed to keep surplus of their harvest after a tax in kind has been paid to the state. At the same time, there had been a ban on markets. So you can't go to a farmer's market, right, and set up and sell your stuff. Lenin lifts that ban. And again, he's doing this in hopes of maintaining his support and hopefully increasing it. While the measure goes a long way, especially in the rural areas, peasants actively involved in revolts are suppressed without mercy by the Red Army during the summer of 1921. And again, who's watching all this? Stalin. He has moved up the food chain. So things that Lenin is doing now as head of the party, Stalin will carry forward and do it to a factor of 10 or 20 or 30, whatever it may be. Artillery, armored cars, bombers, poison gas, all of this stuff is used on the peasants. Many who survive and are captured are shot. 50,000 peasants, as an example, were herded into the first specially constructed concentration camps in the Soviet Union at this time. Lenin says, okay, now that I've taken care of this issue, and I'm spending a little bit more time on Lenin because, of course, he's the architect for what Stalin does and really brings it forward. But so Lenin says, all right, I've taken care of this threat. Now I'm going to look to remove any further threat from the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, many of whom supported the peasants who were revolting against the Bolsheviks. In 1921, you have mass arrests of Mensheviks. There are show trials in 1922. All members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party are branded enemies of the people. Do you want to guess what happens to them? I think we all know, right? So let me see here. There's some stuff I can cut out. So early in 1922, Stalin, who's the general secretary of the Communist Party, is given the task of drawing up a plan of federation, the USSR, okay? That's Stalin's idea, which for someone who's not educated is, a pretty good thing. He brings together the first Congress of Soviets in Moscow in December of 1922. On December 30th, the Soviet republics of Russia, Belarus, the Ukraine, and the Transcaucasian Federation agreed to form a closer union. The following summer, a constitution is established for a new state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. It comes into being on July 6th, 1923. The Constitution gives each republic the right to secede, but this really is an idea more than anything else, because each is governed by the same Communist Party with headquarters in Moscow. The USSR, as we know, stays in effect for the next 70 years, right? It's 89, 90 when it kind of falls apart. It's in the 90s, I should say, when it falls apart. The new state, the USSR, begins to gain international recognition and acceptance. Stalin initially, and again, with hindsight, this sounds crazy, but Stalin is seen as a unifier. He's brought all these disparate areas together. In a decade, that is going to change. So, a turning point is in the summer of 21, there's a huge famine in Russia, in the USSR. 20 million people are on the verge of starvation, prompting a massive international aid effort spearheaded by the United States. With this first international contact, this is where the USSR starts to climb the diplomatic rungs, if you will. And people are saying, hey, this isn't just Belarus and Ukraine and Georgia. They're all under one umbrella. So foreign trade is set up. Remember our talk earlier, where after World War I, France wants to kick Germany as far down the ladder as they can because they're terrified that the Germans are going to reconstitute and come after the French, which is exactly what happens, right, in the 30s and 1940. Well, at this point, countries are saying, hey, there's this new deal over in Russia. Let's start trading with these guys. And of course, it's I guess you can almost compare it to a degree to China today. There's so many people. There's such a huge market for our stuff. And the other thing to think about, in the early 20s, after World War I, the US is the #1 economy, and we're sending stuff to war-torn, Europe. But now Russia, which in and of itself is almost as large as the other economies potentially, people are salivating saying, oh my God, let's trade with these guys. So a lot of this is going on. In 1922, Germany reestablishes full diplomatic relations with Russia. By the end of 1924, most other European countries have formally recognized the USSR. So, of course, and in 1924, that's when Lenin dies. And who's the next one in line? Our boy Joseph Stalin, right? But Stalin's the guy that was able to get Russia, street credibility, if you will. So he plays a huge role. The thought was that Trotsky would be the guy to replace Lenin. He was an extremely able assistant, and he was as ruthless as Stalin in securing, achievements for Lenin, basically keeping people in line. In May of 1922, Trotsky has a stroke. Not until October does he get back to Communist Party headquarters. And by that point, who's running the show? Who's been named the premier, right? Or not the premier, but Stalin has moved up the food chain. 2 months later, Trotsky has a second stroke. He survives, but he dies in 1924. Okay. Or pardon me, that's Lenin. I'm sorry, I'm confusing them. Yeah, I'm sorry. I completely screwed you guys up there. That's Lenin I'm talking about, who has his strokes. Jim, I saw your face and I knew I screwed up. So good thing I'm taping this for everybody for posterity. So in April of 1922, a month before Lenin has his first stroke, he introduces Stalin to some of the more heavier hitters in the party. Stalin, who is a passionate supporter of Lenin, who is a big name Bolshevik, really has been part of that inner circle from jump. The real growth of his power starts in April of 22 when Lenin names him the general secretary of the Communist Party. Stalin has direct control now over party appointments. It gives him the perfect chance to prepare for the coming struggle after Lenin goes, because Lenin is looking at Trotsky as the guy, and Stalin, of course, is saying, okay, how can I get past this? During the remainder of 1922, Stalin appoints 10,000 of his own supporters as provincial officials. Do you think that's going to come in handy in a couple of years? Absolutely. When Lenin comes back to work after his first stroke, he finds that Russia, or the USSR, is now basically being ruled by a triumvirate of Stalin, Lev Kamenev, and Grigory Zinoviev. And I know I'm killing all those names. All three of these guys, the one thing they have in common, they despise Trotsky. They do not want Trotsky to take over. Trotsky is seen as pretty much, and again, glad we're taping this, Trotsky is seen as a horse's ass. They think he's, above it all and an arrogant intellectual and those sorts of things. So Kamenev and Zinoviev, who think, hey, we're the guys, we should be the guys to succeed Lenin, believe that they are using Stalin as a pawn in their own strategies. Of course, doesn't quite work out that way. Lenin, after his first stroke, becomes aware, Stalin tells him, hey, I wouldn't mind taking over, hopefully not for a really long time, but, if something should happen to you, I'm here. So Lenin is looking again at Trotsky, and he sees Trotsky kind of as the yang to Stalin's yin, right? So as a counterweight, if you will. Stalin, after the second stroke, does not let dust gather. He moves quickly. He takes charge of Lenin's doctors and persuades the Central Committee that Lenin should be kept in isolation for his best interests. Lenin basically becomes a prisoner of Stalin, which is crazy. Lenin, in secret, dictates a series of notes intended for the coming party congress, in which he condemns Stalin and recommends Stalin's removal from the post of party secretary. He orders these notes, which then become known as Lenin's Testament, to be sealed and kept in strict secrecy. They remain secret until 1956, after Stalin has died, because what happens in 1923, in March, Lenin suffers a third stroke, which robs him of the power to speak. He watches helplessly as Stalin continues to consolidate his own power. In October of 1923, Trotsky is censored by a massive majority of the Politburo, which is the executive committee for the Communist Party. Trotsky narrowly escapes being expelled from the party. Stalin, who says, hey, here's an opportunity for me to bring my enemy closer to me, he argues against Trotsky's expulsion. But he moves against the other two guys, Kamenev and Zinoviev, his partners in the triumvirate. By 1926, with these two, so Kamenev and Zinoviev align with Trotsky because they see that Stalin now is the horse leading the race. So they get with Trotsky and say, hey, we got to stop this guy. Stalin removes them from the Politburo in 1926. He expels them from the party in 1927 and forces Trotsky out of the country in 1928. So not a bad few years for old Joseph here. In 1928, Stalin says, hey, you know what? Lenin's new economic policy stinks, and he abandons it in favor of state-organized industrialization under a succession of the 5-year plans that we talked about. This, for this long-term effect on Russia, is almost as big as the revolution itself, because it sets them on an entirely different plane. Stalin's new 5-year plans absolutely decimate the peasantry. 25 million households are compelled to basically come together in collective farms or state farms within a few years. Those who resist, you want to guess what happens to them? They are attacked by the Red Army or by the political police. Kulaks, this is what uncooperative peasants were called, were arrested and shot in massive numbers, or they were exiled, or they were sent to, so they could be exiled to Siberia, or they could also be exiled to the concentration camps that we were talking about earlier, and basically worked to death. So collectivization, as it was called, causes a famine first in Ukraine. Stalin's policies, some of which targeted Ukraine specifically, increased the number of deaths and really the misery index, if you will. Stalin continues to export grain rather than rush them to famine-stricken areas. Many of these famine-stricken areas are not fans of Stalin to begin with. So his thought is, well, this is one way to get rid of them. In the Ukraine, famine became known as, the Ukrainian word was the Holodomor, Holodomor, which is Ukrainian for hunger and extermination. Makes sense. 10 million peasants are killed through Stalin's policies during these years.
Wow.
So Stalin, I know it's crazy, absolutely nuts. So Stalin at the time, and again, this is similar to what happens in Korea and in North Korea after the war. Stalin says, hey, let's just start industrializing, left and right. It leads to major failures. What does Stalin do? He says to the guys who are running the show, the industrialization, hey, it's not because my plans stink, it's because you guys don't know what you're doing. Again, want to guess what happens? Those guys aren't around. Yeah. There are new managers put in place. They are pushed into confessing to imaginary crimes. Stalin is successful in rapidly industrializing the USSR, which quite frankly is fairly backward from an industrial stance at this point. And who's watching? Hitler in Germany is watching this, right? And Hitler, think of World War I. Where does where does Germany spend some time? They spend time in Russia, right? So Hitler's watching this, and of course, Russia's on their doorstep. So other noted individuals who said, hey, you know what? I think Stalin is onto something. Not good for their legacy. George Bernard Shaw, of all people, says, hey, I think this guy Stalin is onto something. Oops, not good. So Stalin gets married. Again, he has his second wife, who he marries in 1919, kills herself in 1932. So being around Joseph was not good for your health. They have 2 kids together. Their son, Vasily, dies as an alcoholic after rising in the Russian Air Force, the USSR Air Force, and he does it basically on on his name. Their daughter, Svetlana, really is Stalin's favorite, which isn't saying much. After he dies, she leaves Russia and writes basically a tell-all memoir about her father. Late in 1934, we're at 2:00. We're in great shape. We'll probably run, I'm guessing, no surprise, 10 minutes late, give or take. So late in 1934, the excesses of Stalinism, as it's now known, start to diminish a little bit. Stalin, however, launches a new campaign of political terror against Communist Party members who actually brought him to power. I mean, the guy is out to lunch. His pretext was the assassination in Leningrad on December 1st, 1934, of his leading colleague and primary rival, Kirov, last name Sergei Kirov. Stalin actually arranged Kirov's murder as an excuse so Stalin blames Kirov for the failure of his policies and for the starvation and all these sorts of things. Who then steps up to the plate? And here's where you will start to see, Russian leadership for the next 30, 40, 50 years fall into line. Nikita Khrushchev, who is one of Stalin's boys, if you will. He is the first secretary of the party, and he actually denounces Stalin and survives in a speech. But the reason he survives, he waits until Stalin's dead to denounce him. But while Stalin's alive, he's saying, "Hey, Joseph, good stuff, man. I'm your guy." So Stalin uses show trials to increase the terror. In August of 1936, the two guys that served with him in the triumvirate, Zinoviev and Kamenev, they are brought to trial on trumped up charges, sentenced to death, and shot. See you guys. There are two more major trials in 1937 and 1938. In June of 37, the most influential military personality in the Russian army, and I'm saying Russia, I'm interchanging Russia with the USSR here, but watch me butcher this name. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky. I think I got it actually. So we're on the doorstep of World War II. What does Stalin do? He court-martials these guys on charges of treason and kills them. So just unbelievable. What this allows is truly the true believers, if you will, in Stalin, the guys who are the hardcore of the hardcore to survive and back Stalin up. He kills, so when there are foreign communists who come into Russia, well, they don't leave Russia because Stalin has them killed because they aren't true believers. Just examples of some of the stuff that he does. Let me see here. There's some stuff we can get rid of here. So Stalin, of course, during the war, and we'll talk about it briefly, but it really sets up the Cold War. So during the war, from jump, he's yelling at FDR and Churchill, "Open a second front. I'm getting my head handed to me." The Nazis, Operation Barbarossa, they're driving, the Battle of Stalingrad, and on and on and on and on. And of course, FDR is saying, and Churchill actually was on Stalin's side. They wanted an invasion as early as 42, summer, fall of 42. And FDR saying, we're nowhere near ready. And when they push for it in 43, FDR says, we're getting closer. But again, if this falls apart, good night, Irene. Hitler's going to have free run of the continent. So, of course, it's not until June of 44. But it's during these times, and then as Hitler is nearing his end, at the Yalta conference, at the Tehran conference, at all these different meetings that Stalin has with the Allied leadership, he makes a promise after the war to set up free elections and democratic societies. And of course, we know what happens there. Stalin dies in 53, and it's really not until much later that all of this stuff starts to come out, because there's a real fear that, hey, some of Stalin's lackeys are still running the show. If we come out and say Stalin's such a bad guy, although Khrushchev does it, but he waits a few years after Stalin's death to do it, they're afraid if they come out and pop off against Stalin, they're going to be with him, buried 6 feet deep. So what I want to talk about here, and again, we're at 2 o'clock, so we're really good. A really good point here is the collectivization and the purges, and we've started to talk about it a little bit. And then I'll talk about at the end, we'll talk about just how Stalin is seen in Russian history. So collectivization, it's the first 5-year plan. It's adopted by the party in 1929. They say that here's what's going to happen over the next 5 years. There will be an increase of 200% in industrial output. And of course, the response is, well, when you're starting down here, 200% of not much isn't really a big deal. But they also say that there will be 50% growth in agricultural production. The 5-year plan basically is a return to the plans that were used during the Civil War, 1918 to 1920. And the thought was that the kulaks would be the one who suffered the most. Now they suffered greatly, but the only problem with the plan is others also suffer who Stalin needs for their support. But for the kulaks in particular, their land is seized by the state to form these collective farms. They and their families are sent to Siberia and put to work in agricultural labor camps. 1 out of 5, mainly women and children, die during the journey to Siberia in cattle trucks or on forced marches. When they arrive and are put to work, of course, you're working in Siberia. It ain't nice out. It's like it was here for the past month, basically. 6 million peasants are thought to have died in these work camps, if you will. And again, none of this comes out for decades later, after Stalin's death. By 1935, so this is the first 5-year plan is 1928-29. So in 35, about 2 years after the end of the first 5-year plan, more than 90% of Russia's agricultural land is farmed collectively. The result is a massive decrease in production rather than that increase that they were looking for. What's that, Jim? Go ahead.
No, I mean, when I think they failed, they took the incentive away from the farmers to produce.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, and think of it too, we talked about it a little bit. When they first collectivize, they say, hey, you got to give us everything. And then, Lenin realizes, and I shouldn't say collectivize, but, early on in Lenin's reign, they say, hey, you have to give everything to the state. And if you're a farmer who doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together, you're going to say, go jump in the vat of Vostok. And then Lenin comes to his senses and says, okay, you can keep some for yourself, but you have to pay us a tax in kind. So it's a small step forward, but yeah, this is nutsy stuff. And of course, in our lifetimes, we think of, the news stories where you see like a Russian, store where people are standing in line and there's nothing on the shelves, just because production is so poor. So what happens is that when people don't have stuff, when they aren't producing enough, what they then start to do, which hurts collectivization, they start killing their own animals that are doing the work on the farm. So they're cannibalizing their own resources, which is what Stalin needs for there to be success. So during the early 30s, there are more famines. Millions of people die. However, remember in 1921, when there's the famine, who leads the relief effort? The United States. And Europe gets involved in all these sorts of things. This time in the 30s, God bless, take care. because what's going on? You're in the midst of the major depression, right? A major worldwide depression. So you don't have that support. Also, because Stalin suppresses news of the starvation. So there's not the known need internationally that there was a decade before.
Hey, Jim,
Yes.
here's a movie my wife and I saw. I guess it was on maybe on Amazon Video. It's called Mr. Smith,
Okay.
and it stars James Norton of Grantchester fame, and he's an English reporter who goes to the Soviet Union during that period and reports on it.
Okay.
He's arrested and he gets expelled, and
Right.
he meets with all kinds of opposition. And he's a British newspaper reporter, and it shows how things were,
Right.
and how things were suppressed, and how
Sure.
bad it really was, and the outside world knew nothing
I
about
had
it.
no idea. I'll check it out. No, thanks. That's good to know. That's good to know.
It may not be,
Mr. Smith is the name, Jim?
but if it's not Mr. Smith, then just look under James Norton.
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay, good deal. Thank you. Thanks for that. So while the collectivization movement is a major failure, it turns out to be easier to impose than industrialization, right? You can't, so it's easier to say to, Art and Jim and Bert and Fran, the farmers, to say, okay, you guys have to collectivize and send all your stuff and whatnot. It's much harder to say to Art, okay, Art, you're going to start your own factory and start cranking this stuff out. Of course, it's a major failure. And when Art doesn't crank out what Art is supposed to crank out, one day someone's going to say, hey, where's Art? And Art's not going to be heard from again because it's Art's fault. It's not Stalin's fault.
That Art couldn't do anything.
Exactly. So Stalin, what he does in the hopes of really industrializing, I can't say that word for some reason. What he does is he diverts production away from consumer goods, which of course would get you public support, right? Think of, and here's a really bad analogy, but think of the past year, like trying to get paper towels and toilet paper and Clorox wipes, which I'm a nut. And again, glad this is being taped so this can be played for posterity. My wife used to make fun of me because anytime we had less than 10 packets of those, 10 containers of those wipes, I would freak out. And I told her, I said, when the apocalypse comes, Clorox wipes are going to be the new currency because people aren't going to have them. Well, of course, the past year we haven't had them, and we feel we're so inconvenienced. And so, but the point of my rambling being, this is what's going on in Russia at the time, is Stalin says, don't produce these consumer goods, which of course would get good support. And because of this, there are major shortages in stuff that people need to live every day. What does Stalin do to get Art and his factory to be more efficient? Of course, he threatens Art with his life, but he sets up different schemes, incentive schemes, if you will, for managers and skilled workers. And of course, this goes against the communist ideal and notion of equality. But he also, what Stalin does is he says, hey, Art's factory is really productive because the money that's being paid for labor is low. Well, the reason why is they're not paying people. They're using slave labor, so it keeps those costs artificially low. 25 million peasants are moved from their land to these factories. Of course, when you look at it on paper, the policy succeeds, right? But by the end of the second 5-year plan in 1937, from this standpoint, at least, rural parts of the Soviet Republic are more industrialized. So again, doesn't matter that they're cranking out stuff that people don't want or need or can use, but Stalin can say, hey, in East Jabip, where there was nothing, now we have this shiny factory making widgets. The methods that he uses and the costs really stroke Stalin's ego. And what it does is it helps in constructing a canal to link the Baltic and White Seas. Who does Stalin entrust this to? His hardcore believers and the political police, which at the time were known as the OGPU. Well, what do we know the political police of Russia as? What initials?
KGB.
Bingo, Fran, you get a gold star today. You all do, actually, for putting up with me. But the OGPU becomes the KGB. So what do? They provide the workers from prisons, from the concentration camps. Of the 300,000 who are transported north to dig and work on this canal, more than 2/3 die. So 200,000 of the 300,000 die within a year. The canal opens in 1933.
It was all hand dug, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the thing. That's exactly it. They don't have, a cat or a this, or, the machinery or a backhoe or this sort of stuff, because they just don't have the wherewithal to produce that stuff. And another piece of it is, if you say to the US, hey, send over some of your heavy machinery to help us out. Well, Stalin's not telling anybody he's doing this stuff. There are layers of secrecy involved here. We'll move on to, probably more depressing. So we're moving on from a failed economic 5-year plan, the first and second 5-year plan, to the purges and terror. So,
Jim, I have a quick question.
Yeah, fire away.
Did all this during the collectivization in the mid to late 30s? I would think that from what you're saying, that it really influenced the Soviet Union's ability to stage an army.
Absolutely.
Because they were rather caught off guard initially.
Correct.
By Germany, and I know there was the treaty, but still they didn't have any backup until later in the war when they really got it cranked up.
Absolutely. And to that point, Art, now, anything that Stalin wasn't chucking into collectivization and into this industrialization, ultimately, yeah, he does say, hey, you know what? We need it here militarily. And then that's also, of course, what protects him, if you will, and keeps him in power, helps him to tamp down any resistance. But yeah, absolutely. So even though he signs that non-aggression treaty, he's looking to break it as badly as Hitler is. And he's more focused on those Baltic states. Of course, poor Poland is in the middle of all of it. So when Hitler invades, Stalin is saying, oh my gosh, like, look at what they're letting this guy get away with. And it's not so much the invasion, it's the Sudetenland and it's the Sard Valley and all these other things where Stalin is kind of popping off and saying, hey, wait a second, you think this guy is going to stop at the Sudetenland? You're out of your freaking mind. And of course, Stalin, it's on his front porch, basically, where all this stuff is going on. And he's got a little bit of jealousy. But yeah, absolutely. They are completely caught off guard. Yes, they have the manpower. They have a huge army, many of whom are conscripts, but they don't have nearly the military machinery and industrialization that Germany has. And a big part of it because Hitler is doing it earlier in the 30s than Stalin had been. The Great Terror, as it's known. So unfortunate if you die in one of the earlier terrors, because it's not the Great Terror, which means this is worse than the earlier versions. But the Great Terror lasts from 1936 to 1938. There's a book that I've been reading now for about a year. It's called The Bloodlands. Not exactly a pick-me-up, but it talks about all this stuff with Stalin. I'm telling you, I can only read it in little bits and pieces, because every third page is 40,000 people were killed, or 10,000, or 8,000. And it's like, oh my God, is there anybody left? But that's what it talks about, is Stalin and his move during this time. So in 1934, there's a move that gets you to the Great Terror. Stalin really, until this point, has not really used assassination as a political weapon. Now, yeah, some of, two of the three in the triumvirate, they meet their maker that way, as do others. In 1934, his one-time protege, so the way Trotsky was Lenin's protege, if you will, Sergei Kirov, Kirov, is Stalin's right-hand man. Well, Stalin kills him, has him killed in 1934. In 1926, Stalin actually appoints Kirov in place of Zinoviev, remember, who's one of the three with Kamenev and Stalin as part of the triumvirate after Lenin has his strokes. So Kirov is appointed head of the party in Leningrad, the new name given to Petrograd after Lenin dies. So in the early 30s, Kirov is getting comfortable and starts showing signs of independence, which of course is not good for your health in Stalin's party. So Stalin starts to see him as a rival. In 1934, Kirov is assassinated in his office by a young party member who basically is doing it for Stalin. Stalin acts swiftly, ordering the immediate death of the assassin and 13 supposed accomplices. So, sorry, this is comparable. Remember when we were talking about Japan and they bombed their own train line in China and then say, hey, we didn't do it, the Chinese did it. And then it allows them to, go into all-out war in China, rape of Nanking, on and on and on, even though there was no evidence that China was involved. Well, same thing here. Stalin kind of appoints the guy to kill Kirov and then says, what the heck did this guy do? He kills him and 13 accomplices. He follows with the execution of hundreds of comrades, no pun intended, and deports thousands upon thousands of others for their supposed involvement in the plot. Stalin's the guy who ordered it. So this is the first of Stalin's major purges, which become known to the world primarily through three great show trials held in Moscow in successive years, 1936, 1937, 1938. The first show trial relates to the Leningrad assassination. Stalin's one-time close colleagues, Zinoviev and Kamenev, are charged with conspiring to kill not only Kirov, but the entire communist leadership. How convenient. What a way to get rid of them. They and their co-defendants are found guilty on trumped up charges and assassinated. The next show trial in 1937 charges the accused more specifically with being terrorists, who are in league with Trotsky, who is now living in exile and doing his best to publicize the truth about Stalin. All are convicted, and nearly all of them are assassinated.
Hey, Jim,
Yes,
how did Trotsky end up in Mexico?
I don't know. That's, you know what? You gotta think, and this is just my crazy conspiracy theory mind, you gotta think the US helps him get there.
Somehow,
Some way,
yes.
shape, or form. What's that for him?
I think so, somehow.
That's what I think, Jim, but I'm not positive. You know what? I'll do some digging to see what some of the thought is out there, but that's my own wacky 2 cents.
You know, Stalin had his reach and had him assassinated in Mexico. That's why I brought it up. I thought
Right.
maybe your research showed how he ended up there.
No, it didn't, but you know what? I'll do some digging and I'll email the group. It's a good question, and it's one I've thought about, but I also thought maybe the US, and it's kind of their way to do this to Stalin, to say, hey, like, yeah, you have your reach and you can get your guys, but we can kind of do the same thing here. And especially as Stalin is more power is being consolidated under his leadership. So in 1938, you know, Stalin, and I don't mean to be facetious, he's running out of people to kill. Truly, he's running out of scapegoats. So what he does is he rounds up basically I hate to say it, but a motley collection of people like, okay, let's see, Art and Jim and Fran and Bert. You guys spoke out against me a few years ago. And because there's really nobody else to croak, I'm going to take care of you guys now. So
little paranoia.
Yeah, well put, well put. So Stalin goes after, you know, what opponents have survived, as well as one of the police chiefs who helped him in the earlier show trials, you know, trump up the charges against the assassin of, you know, so as I said, he's running out of people. During this time, the party hierarchy is purged of almost everyone who had a part in achieving the October Revolution. The non-Russian Soviet republics suffer. In some regions, almost nobody over 35 years old remains in place in the civil service, in the army, or in the police. And this is that book I'm reading, Bloodlands. Again, very depressing book. I'm because I'm such a geek, and Russian history isn't my strongest suit. I'm trying to learn more about it. Good God, though, I literally read 10 pages. I'm like, I got to put this down for a week because it's so depressing. So what happens is anyone who comes, you know, sticks their head up out of the sand basically and says, hey, Trotsky wasn't that nuts. Peace out. You're done. Like, these are the people that he's going after. So just absolutely amazing. We'll talk about foreign policy now and kind of end here. So I probably got about 10 to 15 minutes left. If you have to leave, I can send you the entire recording and you get to watch the whole darn thing again if you're gluttons for punishment. So from a foreign policy standpoint, Stalin is watching Hitler and is absolutely jealous of everything he is getting away with. So Russian foreign policy really is centered around, we have to watch this guy. Stalin's first reaction is to enter into more diplomatic networks of the international community. Russia actually, I forgot this, they joined the League of Nations, which is basically a three-legged stool at this point, because remember, Japan leaves the League of Nations basically as Russia comes in, when the League of Nations slaps Japan on the hand and says, hey, you shouldn't be doing what you're doing in China. And Japan says, okay, we're out of here. So Russia says, oh, wait, we'll join. So they joined in 1934. In 1935, the Communist International, or Comintern as it's known, which of course is controlled by Stalin, softens its rhetoric against the bourgeois democracies and declares that its most urgent task is to defeat fascism. Who are they looking at? Benito Mussolini, right? So in 1935, Russia makes defensive military alliances with France and with Czechoslovakia. The appeasement of Hitler by France and Great Britain at Munich, peace in our time, right? In 1938, casts doubt about the strategy for the protection of Russia. And of course, Stalin's in the background saying, what are you guys, idiots? What are you doing? You're giving him all this territory. He's going to run out and come after us. So from Stalin's point of view, the worst possible scenario is for Hitler to be safe from retaliation in Western Europe, leaving him free to look where? At Russia, right? So Stalin is saying, oh my God. And Art, this comes to your point where Russia really hasn't prepared for this. And he's saying, oh my Lord, I'm behind the 8 ball now. So an agreement in Stalin's mind, he's saying, okay, some sort of an agreement has to come up in spite of, who does Hitler dislike? Bolsheviks. What is Stalin? A Bolshevik, right? Well, he also hates the Jews and communists, but at a party congress in March of 1939, Stalin says, hey, you know what? I might sign an agreement with Hitler. Meanwhile, Western nations, March of 39, September of 39, right? Poland is taken off the board. The Western nations are saying to Stalin, don't do it. Don't sign anything with this guy. So August of 1939, a French-British military mission in Moscow is trying to persuade Stalin to join in a treaty to defend Poland. This reeks of World War I in Belgium, right? Belgium gets invaded and then everybody gets involved. So little progress is made because the Poles are refusing to allow the Soviet troops into their territory to attack Germany. And the Poles are saying, guys, we've been down this road too many times. Russia is salivating. You think Stalin is any better than Peter the Great? He's worse. He's going to come in and take us over. So what happens is that Russia and communism, as well as the Jews, have always been, the bad guys in Hitler's oratory. Stalin, invited by the Western powers to join this alliance, which will almost certainly involve him in a costly war against Germany for no benefit other than survival, now finds himself, Stalin finds a more attractive option, saying, hey, you know what? If I just sit on the sidelines here, I'm more likely to get to expand my own Russian Lebensraum, if you will, right? I can grab these territories full of Russian-speaking people. So on August 21st, of 1939, 10 days before Poland gets, their German visitors, Berlin announces that Ribbentrop, who is Hitler's foreign secretary, is flying to Moscow to sign a non-aggression pact with Molotov, the Russian foreign minister. How appropriate. Molotov has a cocktail named after him, right? So this sudden friendship of the two enemies would seem to be inexplicable if people knew the secret protocol behind the pact. So here's what it says. The protocol agrees to set international boundaries, right? After World War I, everybody, and this is what annoyed Japan, we talked about this. Japan said, hey, wait a second. The only other country that had to diminish their army and navy was Germany. They lost. Why are you making us do it? Washington Naval Conference, go jump in a lake. So what happens here is that Ribbentrop, makes a second visit to Russia, acknowledges Germany's approval of Russian annexation of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And they basically say to Russia, hey, if you have the opportunity to do it, go with God. We're not going to get in the way here. It establishes, Russia and Germany establish a division of Poland. They say, here's how we're going to slice it and dice it. Hitler says, okay, now that this is done, for propaganda purposes, remember, that's a big part of totalitarianism. He goes on a propaganda spree, if you will. With this pact, Hitler has space to, of course, go into Poland and basically do whatever the heck he wants. When does, Hitler declares war on the United States a week after Pearl Harbor, and then Russia gets rolled into that, right? So with the outbreak of war, Russia is on the sideline. Hitler doesn't have to worry about them. With the invasion of Poland, I'm talking about. So Hitler says, okay, well, I've got Poland. Russia has the military annexation of Lithuania, of Latvia, of Estonia. And if they want to go after Finland, God love them. So the only problem is the Finns bitterly and heroically fight back. What does it do? It involves the Russians in a very costly winter war, as it is called. Russia prevails, but it's not until March of 1940. And basically, at that point, the world now knows that Russia and Hitler, Hitler knows this. And Art, this is your point. If the Finns are giving the Russians a hard time, no offense to anybody who's Finnish, but if the Finns are giving the Russians a hard time, what will Hitler do to them with his, military machine running at high capacity, the Blitzkrieg, and on and on and on. So Hitler takes note of this and says, hey, you know what? That non-aggression pact I signed, non-aggression, non-ashmession, I'm going after him. So, of course, this is what happens. Hitler knows how poorly prepared the Russians are. During the second half of the 30s, Russia's production of military equipment drastically increases, but much like there's their talk of, hey, we're going to increase production by 200% and agriculture by 90%. When you're starting from zero, 200% of very little isn't a lot. So yes, things are improving, but not greatly. Stalin believes Russia's best chance of remaining outside of the main conflict is to build alliances with his neighbors. He signs a neutrality pact with Japan in April of 1941. And he says, you know what, as long as Hitler isn't coming into Russia, do your thing, man. I'm not gonna bother you. During April 1941, German troops are massing on the Russian border. Hitler's just waiting to unleash hell. As early as autumn 1940, of 1940. So Battle of Britain's going on, right? The Blitzkrieg, London's getting bombed every night, on and on and on. Hitler says, okay, well, if I can't bring Churchill to his knees, where else can I go? I'm running out of territory here in Western Europe. Oh, gee, look, here's Russia. So this is where Barbarossa comes to fruition. December 18th, 1940. Hitler says, quote, the German armed forces must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign before the before the end of the war against Great Britain. And of course, unquote, what is Hitler's other thought in a quick war with Great Britain? If I knock the British out, I know America isn't going to come in and help Russia, right? And he's already taken France off the board. So the longer Great Britain hangs on, the more likely America will get involved in Europe. Of course, it's Pearl Harbor that really gets us involved in the war. And I've said it 10 times, I'll say it 10 more times. It's Hitler idiotically declaring war on America late in 1941. So Hitler in May of 1941 says, if we start now against Russia, we'll be good. The only problem is it doesn't start until June, late June, when 3 different army groups cross the border from southern Poland into the Baltic coast of Russia, and then we go from there. And that's where we end with our good buddy, Josef Stalin. So any questions, comments? This is your last chance to be taped. Show people how smart you all are. I know it, but. Okay. Well, if we have nothing here, let me stop recording before I say something else really stupid here.